Okay, hi everyone. I trust that you can all hear me and see my screen. So I'm really well excited, not because this is the final week that I'm speaking to all of you, but excited because of this topic, because I really think this is a really important issue that we need to be looking at, and it's connected, in fact, to a lot of what we've been talking about, right? With social media and the more and more aspects of our lives basically being digitalized. So this is really about how data has become quite central to a lot of innovations that we use in our lives, and increasingly with greater collection, usage, and analysis of all of that data, right? That are also increasingly privacy concerns for citizens. So yeah, I'm excited to talk about this topic because I really think that this is actually an ongoing and emerging issue. We don't really have clear solutions yet, you know, uh, about all the privacy concerns that's emerging out of data collection and use. Largely also because in my opinion, uh, our concerns about privacy is very much dependent on the kinds of social political context that we live in, the kinds of trust that we have in the states as well in the companies that's collecting the data. And sometimes it's not so clear as well as to who is collecting data and who we should hold people, who should be held accountable, and so on. So yeah, and as such, right? I think even as we before I start today's topic, right? Even as we talk about solutions and all that, it's really important to recognize the kinds of context that's informing all of these issues and informing also the different levels and different kinds of privacy concerns as well. So yeah, and before I start, right, I guess I should give some background and context as to like the where I'm speaking from, right? I organized a citizens dialogue last year on the internet. I think I mentioned this last week. So this was part of a coalition of 70 countries, where yeah, all of us got together and in our respective countries, we organized a series of dialogue with 100 citizens about different aspects of the internet. And one of the themes that came through in these dialogues, right, was the issue of data, personal data, and concerns about privacy, right? And a lot of these data are also captured in transactions, not volunteered, right? But captured in transactions. So yeah, so a lot of the perspectives I have comes from that experience of having that dialogue with 100 citizens in Singapore, as well as having that dialogue about the issue of data governance with in that coalition of 70 representatives, all looking at the issue of data from their own context, right? The other thing that's sort of driving my perspectives as well as my lecture today is my project, right? And Prof. Trisha is also part of that project on data innovation, security, and privacy in across 7 countries in Asia: Singapore, Taiwan, India, South Korea, Japan, Hong Kong, and China. So so yeah, if any of you have questions about that, I'll be happy to share more from that project as well, right? So the motivation for that project was really quite simple. One of the I guess motivations was just to look at what's happening in Asia, because a lot of discourse and debates that's happening about data governance and privacy developing in the European Union as well as the United States. The EU in particular has been very, I guess, proactive in pursuing, I guess what many countries uh, regard as the gold standard of data privacy protection, as and captured in the GDPR, which stands for the General Data Protection Act. Okay, but let me not jump ahead of myself. So I just want to, I guess, lay the background and quite clearly to say that, yeah, a lot of my perspectives that I'm going to share today, right, comes from those two particular projects. So, okay, let me get to it, right? So just an outline. In the first hour, we will be, I mean, in every class I go to, right, I aim to get everyone to sort of repeat the dialogue a little bit, right? I would like everyone to go away from my lectures with some sense of agency and empowerment. So in the first hour, I'm gonna get everyone to recognize your digital identity, right? Think about what kinds of data you share and what do you think is on the internet, right? About you, and yeah, who's perceiving, who's collecting this data, and so on. So so yeah, I will have a little activity for all of you, and hope you can participate as well, right? Because we can only benefit when everyone shares freely, right? Your experiences and your perspectives. Okay, in the second hour, when we come back after the break, I'll move on to talking about the prevalence of data in the context of smart cities. And I mean, I have sort of definition for what we describe as smart cities. I'll get to that, right, when we start on this subtopic. And yeah, but the objective of this second segment is really to help you understand the kinds of data, right? The sort of data landscape, I call it, right? In many of the cities that we live in and visit, right? And also recognize the different levels of concern as well as different levels of personalization of this data as well. Not all data is personal. There's a lot of data that's collected in smart cities. They are not personal data. Okay, but yeah, things can move, right, from being personal to being impersonal, right, with anonymization and giving pseudonyms and so on, and vice versa. Okay, and in the final hour, this is going to be a bit more interactive, and I hope to work with all of you to discuss the different kinds of solutions and opportunities for data citizenship, I call it, right, that has come up. Okay, uh, let me give you sort of an overview, right? Many of you, right, a lot of the data that you know about, right, is kind of um, your consciousness of the data you know about, right? It's kind of confined to the innermost box, right? Because these are the data that that you share. You know that you sometimes volunteer because in return for some services and benefits. For instance, when we have signed up for a free service from Facebook, right? We often volunteer data such as our names, even though many people don't use their real names. But we also volunteer data such as our email addresses, our birth date. And yeah, and as we use the app more and more, Facebook also collects data that we kind of share, whether consciously or unconsciously. Things such as the links that we like, the kinds of people we follow, right? And the people we add to our social networks as well, and our relationship with them. And a lot of these data, right, it's also, I would say, not just collected by platforms, social media platforms like Facebook. A lot of data, that we share is also very much collected traditionally by yeah, municipals, by the government, by the states as well. So a lot of the data that we have, right, is both digital, born digital. It's also yeah, captured in many other systems, right? What is now I guess getting to be a very interesting state of affairs, right? Now is that in the past, because we had all these systems that are actually unlinked, right? A lot of data that you share may reside in one system. System X, right? Will only data used in system X will only be used and analyzed in system X and the purposes of system X. And data shared and captured in another digital platform will only be confined there. But increasingly, we have cities that also have the ability to link all this data together, right? Yeah, thanks or no thanks to a lot of, I guess, linking technologies and yeah, breakthroughs in terms of innovations about how we actually link all these systems, right? So a lot of actually the data that you share, right? Is also telling of your behaviors, right? Many of you may be, because you are taking this class, right? I assume that you all have some I guess by now some sense of actually new media knowledge and how it all converge, right? To give provide certain output or certain information about all of us, right? So a lot of actually this data that you share is also telling the platforms, the people that's collecting or observing you, right? Certain behaviors, things like the ads that you view, right? Would be able to tell someone, right, what are the kinds of products and services you are interested in, or even what kinds of political interests you have, and what kinds of time zones that you live in, right? And the time zones, can also be telling of your geographical location as well. Yeah, and all these behaviors, right? They become some sort of input for the machine to profile all of us. And profiling need not be very, I guess, understood in the traditional demographic sense, not in terms of ethnicity or age, right? The profiling can also be things like, are you dieting right now, right? What are your exercise interests? Are you looking for real estate, right? Are you a newly married person? Are you someone that's on the job market looking for new jobs? What is your income level? What are your political affiliations? Are you, uh, an impulsive shopper, and are you more likely to click through certain links and based on the ads you see by purchase something? So a lot of this information actually are collected by the machine. Okay. Yeah, and so what is the issue here, right? There are several issues, of course, right? What we share, do we know, for instance, how what we share is used by advertisers or companies or even the state? Do we have any say in terms of how such data is used? Are the data, right, that's collected anonymized and protected, right, in a way that is actually good for us, right? Does it protect our privacy and so on? So there's actually a number of issues that that's actually in this data landscape that we don't really, I think the citizens don't really are not really aware of, right? So just to actually maybe deepen the issues, right? Our understanding of this issue a bit better, right? I have a video that I'd like to play for all of you. This was a video that was produced for the Citizens Dialogue that I was leading in Singapore last year. But even as you watch this video, right, I like you to think about three questions. And when we finish watching this video, it's about 15 minutes, right? I would like to discuss all of these questions. Don't worry, there's no right or wrong answer, right? But these are actually questions that is quite you may have your own unique perspectives about, right? Firstly, what data is shared about you, right? What does your data tell about you, right? These are two related questions. How do you think such intelligence is used? Yeah, and secondly, this is a very subjective question. Are you concerned about privacy, right? It almost sounds rhetorical, right? Some of you may wonder, right? Of course I am. Right? What a rhetorical question. But you'll be surprised. I have conducted a number of interviews with people of different age groups where I get different kinds of answers. Yeah, and yeah, it's very interesting to especially hear perspectives from people who say I'm not concerned about privacy, right? And we'll get into more of that, right? I can share more about why they are not concerned. Okay, and if you are concerned about privacy, how do you think such privacy can be addressed, right? Who has the responsibility to address these concerns? Last but not least, we'll see how we do with time before the break. How should data be managed, in your opinion? Okay, so three questions. I'd like you to bear these three in mind. So if you have a pen and paper or just your computer, right, or you could just use your phone, right, feel free to just take a screenshot of these three questions so you won't forget them. Okay, so I'll give you 5 seconds to do that. Okay, I think most of you should be done, right? Or if you have a pen and paper, you can scribble these questions on your notes, right? So I will play this video, right? I've also put in the link at the bottom. So later when you review the slides, you can click on them. Okay, sorry for the pause just now. I was trying to see how to mute myself and then yeah, it stopped. Okay, let's have a brief discussion before we go for a break. Okay, I'm flashing the questions that I flashed earlier, right, for discussion again here. Anyone would like to, I guess, respond to either, you could either respond to any of the questions that I flashed on the slide, or maybe if you like, you can share your thoughts about the video. I mean, the video, I hope you enjoyed it. Right, I think it's just such a rich source material to discuss a number of issues about data. For instance, who to trust, right? You would notice that people had different, just like really different perspectives. Some people say, oh, the government, right, should take responsibility. Some say, okay, I don't trust the government, it has to be an NGO. Some say multiple stakeholders. And then there's quite a number of I guess citizens sort of throwing out solutions as well, right? So there are people who say, oh, you should diversify your accounts, try to have different accounts and different identities, so it's not so easy to link everything back to you. But yeah, I mean, I've heard of that kind of solution before, but I can also tell all of you that has limitations. There are also ways to link, right? Even if you try to intentionally, okay, maybe on Instagram, you use a different name or different set of pictures and all that, but there's still enough actually data points to do linking, right? If people want to link. And then there are also solutions about policy, right? And there are, you will notice in the video, there are there are people interviewed who say, oh, the regulation should make sure there's basic protections and so on. But there's a challenge as well, of course, right? Because technology will always be faster than policy, than regulations. So when regulations catch up, right, it's usually to respond to certain vulnerabilities that has been exposed by a certain state of technological development. But because technologies develop so quickly, right, the challenge is really how do you actually develop regulations and policy that's quick enough to deal with the new vulnerabilities. So yeah, so that's actually one of the things that's kind of coming through as well, right? And then there are people who say, oh, make everything go to a cloud, right? but then who owns the cloud? That's a question. So okay, I've actually kind of talked enough. I'm wondering if anyone in the room, or either Lucas or Sophia, you like to unmute yourself to share. Hi,
Yeah,
Lucas.
I think for some services it's just mandatory to share your data as they are free. So if I expect something that nice like Instagram or Facebook, such a sophisticated service, of course I need to pay somehow. And if I'm not willing to pay any money directly, they need to earn money from me. So it's kind of okay, as we also watch TV and we get television. But of course, we don't want our privacy so much invaded as they currently do. So we have those measures just announced by Apple, or many people now starting at least trying to protect their data. I mean, I also have like a couple of fake email accounts and so on for services where I don't want to be directly connected to myself, at least to my name. Yeah.
Thanks, Lucas. That's really interesting. I like yeah. Thanks for sharing your strategy. Having multiple email accounts. I have them too, but it's more because I often forget my passwords. but but yeah, I mean, I really like your take on actually how sharing data in return for services it's okay. I'm wondering if others have perspectives on that as well, right? Do you agree with Lucas, right? That sharing data is okay, or you have a different take on it?
I do agree with Lucas that sharing data is okay. Actually, I do think that as the user of many platforms, it's a bit hard to say that I don't consent to using certain to the company using my data for their own users. Uh, yeah, but I was just thinking also that as we live in an increasingly in a world where we use a lot of technology, it's really hard not um to not have control over what who has access to the data as well. Like in Singapore, there was a SingHealth breach where a lot of the patient records where like we had this where the records of patients were hacked and and a lot of this confidential information was actually uh retrieved by this other company. And uh and yeah, so I was just wondering like when actually they did this um the the check to when they did an investigation, they realized that oh actually there was like a lapse in the s- the civil service, the people who were and they didn't do like, and some of them actually they didn't really escalate the issue well. So
Mm.
it's not just the tech thing, but it's also like a cultural issue.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Sophia. Thanks for raising the issues. So yeah, Sophia, correct me if I'm wrong. So I think you are in agreement with Lucas, right, in terms of how sharing data is okay in return for services. But I think you through the example that you brought up, right? I think you are actually touching on the issue of trust, because uh, yeah, it's not that it's hard to tell what to trust and who to trust, right, in the whole journey of how your data is managed, right? Firstly, there is the question, or rather the issue of how data is actually disposed or secured, right? And so yeah, so the trust, right, is actually not just in the agency or state that is collecting the data, but it's also in the policy that's actually informing the governance, the management of the data, right? And then of course I mean, the case that Sophia mentioned is actually a very major breach of data, right? Basically, SingHealth is a major government agency, right, that has patient records, that has actually records of health records of yeah, almost everyone in Singapore, right? And there was a major breach where yeah, even our prime minister's health records, right, and the national identity of yeah, just millions of citizens were stolen. So yeah, yeah, thanks Sophia for posting the link, right? So if you'd like to know more about this case, you can check out the link. And I think what's really critical, right, when things like this happen, is that it kind of starts to actually breed distrust in terms of not necessarily in the state, but in terms of the policy that's actually and the whole process, right, as to how data is managed, but also the people also got very cognizant and aware that there are insidious actors out there who can, with very sophisticated skill sets, right, who can break into servers that they want to steal identities. So that's I guess that's a concern you have, right, about that, Sophia, right, that you shared. um yeah, and yeah,
Yeah,
the question of how can such concerns be addressed, right, remains outstanding, right,
yeah.
in a way.
I apologize if I wasn't clear explaining, but I've already posted the links below. And the second link actually is some of the key findings that this that the investigation actually found. And yeah, I was also thinking about, like, even if you trust the system, you also need to trust the employees and make sure that they have the relevant training, how to escalate, and to be skilled in to be IT savvy enough, and raise the awareness lah
Yeah,
when comes. Yeah.
yeah. So, and just to share, yeah, in response to this case, right, in Singapore took a number of measures. For instance, after this case, people no longer collect our identity card numbers for everything. But before this, right, I still remember, like, even if you are filling in a lucky draw, like a form to participate in the lucky draw, everyone fills in their identity card numbers. So yeah, after this case, I think a number of measures were taken, where yeah, it was like no longer allowed, right, to just use identity card numbers for everything. So that's actually kind of a policy response. Yeah. Yeah, there were also other technological responses, like delinking, yeah, and separating, like transactions that's really highly confidential and secure from the internet. So in government agencies in Singapore, we have civil servants that have actually two computers. They literally work with two computers. The one that's linked to the internet, that's is usually used for less secure transactions, and yeah, the more secure work, right, actually happens on the desktop that's not linked to the internet. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, thanks Lucas and Sophia for sharing. Maybe I can invite someone in the room to either respond to the video, right, or just any of the questions that's on the slide.
Hi, can you hear me?
You need to speak louder.
Speak louder.
Mm.
I think you can just try. Yeah. Okay. I was thinking that sharing our data is quite normal, and I think it's okay for us to share our basic data, like what mentioned on the PPT before, like our, I think, like birthday or names or others. I think that's okay as long as it didn't won't threaten our freedom of speech. I think because I thought about the case in China, like whatever they were talking online and they will be monitored by the government. I think that's that's the problem when all of their information on network being controlled by the government, and that really related to the privacy and also affect their safety, I think. Yeah.
Oh, sorry, I was muted. Okay, sorry. May I know who was sharing? I didn't get your name.
Esther, I'm Esther.
Esther. Okay, thanks, Esther. Yeah, thanks, Esther. I think you really brought up a really interesting point, which has to do with the purpose of sharing data, right? And yeah, and the concern actually corresponds to what kind of purpose people have for collecting and sharing such data, right? Yeah, you brought up the case of China, or of or rather the example of China, where maybe some yeah, freedoms are curtailed, or some safety issues actually come up because of the identity actually being known, right? And this is an example of surveillance, which I will actually talk about yeah, in the next half of today. So yeah, thanks for actually everyone for sharing. And I think the other thing that or rather the last point I actually want to, sorry, is there someone else?
Yeah, someone else
Okay,
wanted.
sorry, please go ahead.
Where should I read? This one? Hello. Hi, it's
Hi.
me. I remember that in a video, somebody said that our surfing on the internet will tells us about our choices. And I was really interested by the word choices that he mentioned. I think that um, because now we gather information from the internet mostly, and the track that we are searching the internet will tell us about what we are curious about. And um, so I think that um, I do agree with the question that what does your data tell you about? I think I agree with the interviewee in the video that it's about our choices, but um, I'm actually a bit maybe confused, like why, uh, in what part of our privacy are we concerned? Because now, like, for example, on social media, we like to post about ourselves, like our daily lives, the happy moments we have. But then on the other hand, we don't want other people to know about our password or our maybe online shopping records. So I think about um, the concerning policy, we need to separate um, the things that we share online to two parts, like the ones we want to share and the ones that we don't want to share with other people. And it's like, I think it's based on our own favor, like, but then the people who controls the internet or the data, they have different purposes. So what they want is different from what we want, but they have the power. So
Mm.
I think that's the point, that like in the video someone says that it's hard for someone to really own the data since they don't know the know-how about how these information transport. And so maybe one of the keys to let us know really how do the information transform. I remember in the video it tells us how does the internet work, and if
Mm.
more people can be educated into that part, then I think that will be a start point. That's my opinion.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks Ming Ming for excellent perspectives. Yeah, and I mean I am very fascinated by choices, right? The theme of choice as well, because I think how much choice we perceive is very much depending on the kinds of environment we live in as well. There may be citizens who think that it's right for me to actually assert choices over what kinds of data to share, what kinds of data not to share, right? And we look to policy responses to actually give us this choice, to give us those choices. But a lot of the perception of choices is also something that is actually perceived in a bounded way. What do I mean? It means that, like, for instance, if you're only shown, because there's so much information out there, right? So much potential uh, ways that you can design options, right? As to what data to share, what data not to share, right? You are kind of limited by the options that you see. The choice you have actually is limited within the options that you see. I mean, likewise, even when we are talking about, like, choosing to like certain or follow certain pages and all that, a lot of actually these choices that we are actually making, even in the social media, on our social media platforms, is also kind of bounded, right? Because it is driven by the kind of algorithms that's showing us what we think what it thinks we are interested in. So there may be a lot of actually other things that we are interested in, but which we may potentially click on, but because the algorithms assume that we are of a certain profile, it gives us only choice 1 to 10, right? And we make choices within that boundary. So yeah, I also really like your point about how actually the solutions could be thinking about maybe more innovations. I mean, the innovations actually can come in this way, right? More innovative ways to allow people to actually make certain choices about how their data will be managed. That's actually a kind of something that I see actually developing in the EU, right? The European Union, with the GDPR, where they have actually mandates, right? Put in to make companies, as well as, yeah, and basically any agency or institutions that's collecting data, to actually allow citizens to have explore choices. But a lot of, I think, even as we are actually making choices, it's still this is gonna be my last response, right, before everyone goes for a break. It's still actually premised on the principle of consent, right? I make my choice and I say yes, I consent. Um, the the implication is that even when you have actually the availability of consent and choice presented to different people, there's enough research to tell us that, especially for people who are marginalized, who don't experience digital platforms or privacy the way actually many literate people do, right? They actually may not understand what this consent means, right? So one other way to think about that, actually, as a solution, is to move away from solutions, or rather to also actually offer the principle of accountability as a solution, not just the principle of consent. Because technically, right, if everything is just about consent, companies could just design things, right? Um, Maybe, I'm not saying everyone does it, right? But it's possible, right? They could just design things maybe in an unethical way, but because of the way it's presented, people consent to it, right? Without really knowing about or understanding the kinds of manipulation that takes place with their data, right? One idea is to actually also move towards solutions that's actually premised on accountability, calling for accountability by yeah, just basically any institution or company that collects data, other than just depending on citizens to make choices, right, to consent. So yeah, that's actually my thought, right? My response to your yeah, response. So that's yes, Trisha, yes, please. Sorry, I think you're muted.
There. Yeah, okay. I think I just have one thing to add because I think you, in the old video, you mentioned lots of different issues and then you have covered. But I think that's one thing in terms of who owns the data. We own the data, or we actually the data is owned by the big tech, or those people who buy the platforms and then free services for us. So they own the data, they use the data to actually have the businesses with any other people who are interested in our private personal information. So recently, I think EU has a Digital Service Act. They are more looking at how to regulate, the big techs and let them know their obligations. And so even though we, as a I think average ordinary people, we don't really know how the data has been used or algorithm and how the data being traveled to anywhere. But I think maybe the governments or regulators, they should still be involved to looking at, how the big tech companies actually have any kind of, sort of returning to general collective data and to help no matter it's our business or the personal life, I think that's something, even though it's free and we've got services. But I think in Taiwan, I joined one of the conference I think several years ago talking about cloud computing. I feel a little bit sad because they talk about the privacy issues and talk about cyber attack and then maybe leaking of the very confidential information. So they said, who owns the data? Should we actually have the local data owned by Taiwan or any specific country? And the very high level IT person, basically maybe in charge of design infrastructure of our country said, nobody actually can be better than Google or the big companies that actually so we don't even think about as a small country that we should own our data or we can protect our data. We are very happily to be part of the ecosystem of the global situation. So I don't know how to think about that, but like Lucas, you're from EU, probably you have a big community that you can have the power to say, oh, DSA, I want the act, I want the company to help do this and do that. But I don't think there's no country like Singapore. Perhaps we also don't. Yeah, so that's a little bit sad about that. I still have no solution, but I do see lots of problems about that. Thanks.
Yeah. Thanks, Trisha. I fully agree with you. I think this is really problematic, and it's actually it's about power, very much power geopolitics as well, right? I see a lot of actually movement coming from the EU, largely also because countries in the EU, they have sort of a collective, right? They have that collective of member nations that are actually uh, very diverse, of course, many different agenda and interests. But at least I think on this uh, front of actually calling for more accountability from the tech companies, they are kind of united. Um, but yeah, I think the other problem, I fully agree with you. Actually, for smaller countries, smaller states, right, like Taiwan and Singapore, we are kind of quite often at the mercy of I mean, quote unquote mercy, right? Because quite often it is a partnership as well, right? Because actually many of our cities and many of the apps in our cities are also developed with private companies, right? So the interests are kind of blended, right? And also develop in a neoliberal sense as well, right? Because private companies, they often have, yeah, of course, economic interests, right? So they may not be so interested in problems that are not so scalable, doesn't actually, is not so easily configurable, and so on. So there is, I think, I have no solutions as well, but yeah, I fully agree with you. This is uh, a very actually edgy issue that we should be addressing as well, especially for smaller nation states. Yeah. Okay, maybe after the break, yeah, people in the class, right? If you have thoughts about this discussion, right? I would love to hear your perspectives as well, because like what Prof. Trisha says, we don't really have solutions right now. So, but I'm aware that the first hour is up and you're all overdue for your break. So let's take a 10-minute break and we'll come back yeah, we'll start again in 10 minutes. So enjoy your break. See you in a bit. Okay, it's 10 minutes past. So let me start. Thanks, Lucas, for actually sharing this in the chat. I just projected it up here because we were talking about GDPR, mentioned it quite a few times just now during our discussion. So yeah, thanks, Lucas, for sharing this graphic, which gives you an overview of what GDPR is about. So GDPR, for those who are not aware, right, stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, right? And it's something that came out of the EU, right? There's a number of actually principles that need to be present, and that's kind of enforced through GDPR. Like for instance, lawfulness, transparency, right? So for data controllers that collect data, they need to ensure that yeah, um, people actually understand what data they are collecting, and they need consent. They also need to actually make known their purposes and make sure that the data is only used for such purposes, right, that they have defined. There's also, yeah, the principle of data minimization, which is actually an interesting one. I've also seen this particular principle being applied to a number of countries, right? In my research project on data governance in Asia. So data minimization means that, yeah, as far as possible, yeah, actually data should only be collected for the purposes, only the minimum data that's needed for the purpose. So excessive data, so this principle is, if you can understand it, is really meant to actually be introduced to prevent excessive data collection. Um, yeah, and then yeah, there's also accuracy, right? Must keep data accurate. Data must not be stored longer than needed for that purpose, right? And also data must be actually protected from yeah, unauthorized access and not shared freely. Right, only the agency that's actually collecting the data for the intended purpose is allowed to actually access the data. Yeah, and yeah, actually the principle of accountability is something that I talked about just now as well, right? The I yeah the idea behind this principle is to also ensure that yeah, data controllers and institutions, right, need to make sure that uh, in all that they do, right, there's this yeah, general sense of accountability towards the people. So I think one thing that I would say is that, yeah, I mean, this actually GDPR is really something that's designed to maximize the protection of individual data, right? And I mean, if you look at the approaches in the US, it's a bit of a mix, right? There is a sort of what I would call a light touch approach in a way, where there is, I think, a general consensus in terms of individual protection, but the approaches there is also kind of trying to balance between individual data protection and encouraging innovations and economic development. Sometimes I think there's this idea, and I think this is contested, right? This idea that data protection is at tension with innovation. With a lot of companies saying, the more regulations there are for data protection, individual protection, the less innovations, right? It can be they see as a counterproductive to the kinds of innovation they can come up with. But what's also been interesting for me is to actually encounter situations where it's not necessarily a tension, where the regulations in fact can be developed to encourage innovation, to encourage innovations, for instance, in data protection, to also actually, I guess, allow for some data, right? So long as they are pseudonyms, anonymized, right? For the purpose of doing experiments, doing simulations and innovation development. I saw that in the case of Singapore. I saw that in the case of Korea, for instance, where yeah, data, right? Some some types of data, they are anonymized and actually set aside for the purpose of innovation development. So it really, I think, also it's about how we set up, right? The other thing that I will say actually about how GDPR actually is spreading beyond the EU is also, in my field. Maybe Prof. Trisha, you can comment on this as well. How I saw certain principles like being selected, right, to actually be applied. Like for instance, the principle of fairness and transparency, right? This is my earlier point, an example about how there may be platforms and companies that write on this particular principle to say, okay, we will ensure fairness and transparency by, yeah, declaring how we are going to use, collect what data we're collecting and how we're going to use the data. And in order to continue with the service, individuals must consent, right? So this is actually one principle that's plugged out to be operationalized, right, as a tool. But what I also see as problematic is when only one principle is plugged out, right, but not the whole thing, right? So when there are like selective plugging of tools, right, what can happen is that on the whole, there's still not enough, I think, uh, oversight and actually governance, proper governance of the data, right? And just for instance, writing on the individual to consent can be very limiting as well, because individuals may also not understand what are the implications of their consent. And like the earlier video showed, right? People don't want to read 50 pages of a legal document, right? I'm guilty of the same thing, right? When I have to read new privacy updates, right? There's a tendency for me to just scroll to the end and agree instead of reading through every single clause, right? So when we only adopt certain like one principle and not the whole framework, right? That can be actually limiting. Yeah. So yeah, I just want to respond to this slide about GDPR a little. Yeah, I think Prof. Trisha, you have yes, something to add.
Yeah, I just want to talk about Taiwan's situation in response to the GDPR application. I did not really go into the details how actually we have adapted, but at this moment, because we really, I think it's more for economic issues that Taiwan will consider to actually, sort of comply with GDPR's standard, looking at more like more, I would say, stringent ways to actually regulate the companies. But we have actually sent our sort of cases, the Taiwan's cases, to EU for examination. I think that's last year, but still waiting for the results. That's one thing actually we also have done because we don't really have a dedicated agency that overseeing privacy issues in our country. So that is a big problem. So last December, I think there will be a new government agency called Digital Development, Department would be formed, but it's still under the legislative yuan to go through because they are scattered, and then we have outdated Privacy Protection Act, like a personal data protection. So everything needs to go through, and then I think that's a good start because I think GDPR led us to looking at what actually privacy means. In Asia, I think we tend to not take that so serious. And then indeed, like Mimi mentions, the media literacy or digital literacy has raised the attention. And then we're looking at social media and we're looking at lots of data problems. Even in Taiwan, we have cyber attack, info warfare, lots of different kinds of issues. So people think about data more, I think, in recent times. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Trisha. I have a question. Is that like you mentioned there's no dedicated government agency that looks after like the governance of data, right? What about civil society? Is there like civil society groups that's actually present in Taiwan that pays particular attention to, yeah, like issues about data privacy and governance?
Okay. So that, at least I think we have lots of civic groups, and then I think there's one constantly looking at the digital human rights. It's called Taiwan Association for Human Rights. Basically, when we have the project with you, we have interview, and they have started looking at even we have the national health care, right? So everyone will have a health card, and so in the past they also overwatch, how the so-called scholarly organization of people actually want to use aggregating data to looking at the issues or for more like research purposes. And also, they recently raised attention to the EID because we want to transform all the physical IDs to digital IDs, and then that's another constitutional, I would say, court cases that the civic society against the government because they don't think they go through very secure, standards uh, to think about, just very quickly transform everything into the digital data. So for the COVID-19, and that's another issue. But in Taiwan, perhaps you all think that Taiwan is actually quite in a safe status. Yes, we are. But the civic groups, they also raised attention. I think since last April, when the COVID-19 a little bit subside, and they mentioned, so who actually oversee, all the different organizations, NGOs, your different places they collect our data, and how long should they withhold our data, and for what purposes? So in May, last May, they had an act, actually had very, I would say, guideline about how long, like 28 days, you can hold the data, and then some specific details. But still, I think that's not enough. The good thing is that there's always have the civic groups in Taiwan. When I would say ordinary people, they don't really know what happened. They only care about the daily life. And there's some intelligent people. They have the IT specialties. They have lots of human rights concerns. They will work, for the common good to have the dialogue with the governments. And so when I interviewed some of the government officers, and they said Taiwan is a place that you couldn't really push any, maybe I would say even it's good or bad, any law or any practices in the government right away, because there's always people will discuss with you, and it takes time. But maybe that's a better things not to rush. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, thanks, Trisha. I really like your point about actually, yeah, the presence of civic groups in Taiwan. And you also talked about actually how they are made up of the tech elites, right? The people who actually understand how technology works, people who are lawyers, people who are actually who understand policy, right? But this is actually, I think, something that's quite unique to Taiwan. In actually countries like Singapore, a lot of these urban elites, right? I call them. These are like the lawyers, the regulators, the policy researchers, and the technologies, right? They're often, I guess, concentrated either in government, or in the commercial companies. So as a result, right, we don't have actually, there's this huge gap between the ability of or even how much the citizen knows enough to be able to participate in decision making about data, and even if them having a say in how much control they want to have. And there is this gap because the citizen doesn't know, and this is why I think we really need civil society, civic groups to step in, right, to represent the citizens in this whole negotiation with tech companies, tech platforms, yeah, as well as actually any organization that collects data, including the state. So yeah, so I just want to actually, I guess, respond to that, right? That in Taiwan's case is actually quite special in Asia, where you have actually these civic groups that are there, right? Another case that I know of that has a similar kind of structure is India, where they have civic groups that looks after and you have actually the tech elites there in these civic groups as well. That's involved in these negotiations with the tech platforms, with the government, but they represent the people. Yeah. Okay. So, sorry, let me move on. Okay. Now I'm coming to the next segment. So I hope that that was a very long discussion, but I think it was really good. I really enjoyed the discussion, and I hope that all of you get a sense of what data is actually being collected, or maybe even if not personally, in your own society, in your own groups, right? What data is collected, and what are the prevailing issues about all this governance of data. Okay, I want to actually, I guess, scale it up a little, right? Because so far we've been talking a lot about social media and the kinds of data that we share on social media. But yeah, social media, I think in the data landscape is just one small fragment of it. I want to, I guess, zoom out to the big picture, right? When cities become smarter, right? Increasingly for many of us, we live in cities. We are Our experiences and encounters with data are often kind of influenced by the types of technologies and the types of sensors and activities that's happening in the cities. So what are the implications? So just to, I guess, provide an overview, right? I think we can think of the data landscape, right, in the city through sort of three segments. One of the theme in this, uh, in this big picture, right, is the activity of gathering, right? Data is collected not just through the apps we use, right? Smartphone apps like Facebook and Instagram, right? Or even our apps, right? Uh, our government apps, right? For instance, we also a lot of data is also collected through sensors, through cameras that's installed all over the city. We may or may not be actually aware of these kinds of data collection methods, right? Because many of the sensors, for instance, they are so small and so unobtrusive, right? You don't even know that it's there. I don't know about Taiwan, but in Singapore, for instance, there are certain areas, entire towns, for instance, in Singapore, that actually has a sensor and a camera on every lamppost. So yeah, so long as you are out of your home, right, you are captured on camera, right? There's a lot of data that's collected, but data collection itself is, I think, insufficient, right? You may have a lot of data, but actually data that's not analyzed and simply collected is not useful. So a lot of how we actually make sense of all the data that's collected actually depends on the analysis stage. So yeah, data collected, for instance, can be analyzed live, right? For instance, if you are interested, right, or if you are working in an agency that is interested in policing crime, for instance, right, there may be uh, a criminal that you're looking for, right, and you could be actually analyzing, looking for that particular criminal through facial recognition technology. And the data comes through the CCTVs, right, that's installed in the city. And yeah, your analytics, right, can be embedded with facial recognition technologies and algorithms to find your criminal, right? This is not hypothetical, right? I know for a fact that this is happening in many cities. Like London, for instance, is, I think, after the 2012 London riot, right? It is, or rather London crisis, right? It is one of the I think top cities in the world, right, that has the most number of CCTVs in the city, right? Not Singapore, not Taiwan, not Germany, but it's London that has the most number of CCTVs in the city, right? And a lot of how it is used is very much, if you look at it, right, it's very much for policing and looking for unrest, yeah, and safety, right, for safety purposes. So yeah, a lot of the data that's collected, right, comes through, and analyzed live through this kind of dashboards and visualizations. But it's not just, I think, for current users, right? A lot of them are also used to do predictions, like predict predictions about traffic flows, for instance, and the data is actually analyzed to try and control the traffic, right? So yeah, as I was talking about analysis, right, I was talking a lot about usage as well. And this is really because we often analyze data based on the intended usage, right? Intended purposes that we have. So yeah, there's actually automated purposes that are, I think, quite innovative, right, and quite exciting in my opinion, right? Data analyze, right, to try and actually maximize sustainability. Yeah, for instance, in Singapore, there is actually a particular, I think, a municipal, or rather town area, right, where they try to use sort of live sensors, right? I mean, they use sensors to actually detect the temperature in the area, right? And they come up with predictive actually models as to what the temperature or average temperature is going to be like in that area. And when the right time comes, I mean, certain sprinklers are turned on, or certain um, uh, what do they call that? The flaps, right? To control the wind, right? Switched on in certain direction to direct the wind coming through the area. So that's actually an example of a smart city application where data is actively used to try to actually improve the livability of the area. So as you all of you know, if you have visited Singapore, you know it's very humid. It's extremely hot at certain times of the day, right? This particular town in the east, in Singapore, right? They use this kind of smart city and application, right, to control the temperature, average temperature, like that their citizens actually experience living in the town. So yeah, I don't recall the exact number, but I think it can bring down the average temperature about 2 to 3 degrees, right? Which makes a huge difference, especially if you are experiencing like -33 degree weather in Singapore, where it's just sweating all the time as well. So so that's one example of usage, right? But there are other examples, of course, like I mentioned, like doing traffic controls and yeah, predictive policing as well. You may be wondering, how does policing become predictive? Yeah, it can, right? I know we often think of policing as, oh, when the crime happens, the police, you direct the police car there, or you direct the security, to a certain area, right? But some of the examples I've seen also coming from certain towns, for instance, in the US, right? They are able to detect hotspots, right? Where there's actually likely going to be social unrest or high crime, right? And these hotspots, right, are identified through a number of ways. For instance, yeah, the CCTV could detect, uh, persons of interest, right? Persons who their database identify as potential, I mean, as drug dealers, right, in their database, going to a certain area, right? Or you could have actually social economic data that's actually about the area, that's linked to your CCTV intelligence as well, right? Which, I mean, my main point is that multiple uh, sources of data, right, can point to an area as and point to an area being identified as a hotspot for potential crime and social unrest. So this is actually an example of predictive policing. So smart cities, right, actually combine all these multiple points of data, right, which is why, as I mentioned earlier, right, in response to the point I think raised by Stephanie Lee in the video, right, about how, we can try to evade, right, by having diversifying accounts and so on. And I mean, I responded to that by saying, yeah, actually, that has limitations, right? This is exactly, what I'm talking about, right? Even if you try to diversify, right, digitally, then you can be linked through other ways as well. So, so yeah, the bigger question is actually what's governing all this collection and analysis of data, and what their purposes of use should be, right? That is actually, I think, the more crucial questions and gaps we need to identify, address, right? So just to, I guess, give you an overview of the landscape, right? In terms of data landscape in smart cities. This is also in your readings, so you don't really, I mean, the reading itself will elaborate this as well. So like if you look at the sector, for instance, like health, you have actually different kinds of data that's collected and representative, or rather indicative of the health well-being, right? Health data, survey data about health, right, can also be linked to actually your health records. And there are also like applications in the smart city that can be indicative of the overall level of health and well-being in the city, right? For instance, the noise level, noise pollution level, right? Health problems in a specific neighborhood, right? So for instance, if you have actually citizens coming from a particular area that's actually going to the hospital for things like lung infection, respiratory problems, right? These kind of indicators can be used to actually, again, right, identify uh, yeah, certain intelligence about the data, about that city area. Maybe there could be like problems with the water or the air, right? That's actually prevalent in the neighborhood. And then, yeah, some kind of mitigations can be, or interventions can be done, right, to address the problem. And then you have actually, I think, cohesion issue, sectors of cohesion. And again, you have actually different kinds of data that's actually representative of or indicative of the level of social cohesion in your city. Yeah, things like survey data, right? Postings on the internet, right? For instance, if you have, I mean, in the US, for instance, you have actually lots of postings that's actually quite hateful, right? Either against the blacks or against the whites, right? And you have actually data about the ethnic distribution in a neighborhood. When such actually tensions are very high online, right? Sometimes we can see it translating to the kinds of strife, conflicts, and tensions in particular neighborhoods, especially when either the black or the white community is a minority in that neighborhood, right? So yeah, actually this kind of demographic data is actually very uh, useful as an application as well, right? But you also have other kinds of actually examples like school quality in specific neighborhoods, right? Can be used to indicate the kind levels of social cohesion as well, right? So yeah, I mean in Singapore we have schools that are very quite mixed, right? Because there's a lot of affirmative action in Singapore, where yeah, it's a very intentional design that schools actually have different people from different races. They are mixed. But in the US, for instance, you have actually schools that are mostly blacks or mostly whites, or rather, yeah, schools that are mostly minority, made out of minority races. So yeah, the depending on the racial composition, right? The school quality and the kinds of problems that's actually emerging in the neighborhood actually differ. Yeah, and yeah, so I hope, yeah, those two examples give you an a broad overview and a sense of how this table, how you can understand this table, right? And you can see that actually, I mean, the different kinds of sectors is quite comprehensive, right? This also points to potential different kinds of data that's possible, not just coming from the apps, from the sensors and CCTVs, but also coming from yeah, actually the day-to-day transactional transactions that we have, either with government agencies or with commercial entities, right? Okay, and yeah, just actually, I find just to give you actually this framework about how to think about different kinds of data as well as its purposes, right? Because earlier I showed, I talked about this in the context of smart cities, where we have actually different kinds of data being gathered and analyzed for different purposes, right? And I think I think this was also a point that Ming Ming shared earlier, right? It's about purposes, right? There are some things that we are okay with sharing, some things we are not okay with sharing. And I think this framework actually helps us to understand these different spectrums, right? So on the vertical spectrum, right, you have actually data ranging from personal data to actually not non-personal data, right? By non-personal, this just means that this is actually data that doesn't identify you as a unique individual. So it could be just like traffic data, right? You may be one data point that contributes to an overall dashboard, for instance, telling someone how many people is in this place right now, right? So you are just that one data point, and nothing about that data point it would uniquely identify you as an individual. So that's actually an example of impersonal data. And you have actually on the horizontal spectrum, right, axis, where it is about purpose, right? And it's about for what purpose, right? Is the data used? So you have actually data used to actually provide services, right? So on the left end, you have service there, right? Service purposes. And you have data that is actually used for surveillance, right? We talked about policing just now. And policing is actually, an example of surveillance, data used for surveillance. And once I think, so yeah, again, this is actually in the reading by the same author, Van Zunen. So so you actually, once you have this kind of spectrum, right, we can think about actually the different kinds of data and for what purposes they are used, right, to really fully get a good sense of the data landscape. So on the top leftmost quadrant, I'll just call it I, right? You have personal data that's used for service purposes. Personal data such as like births and death, right? Birth registries, or even transactions in the city, right? Me taking uh, I don't know, making a restaurant reservation, for instance, right, where I have to provide my name, my contact number, right? These are actually transactions in the city, right? Uh, and it's personal, right? It's personal data, but it's actually volunteered and offered, right, in return for actually receiving services and social benefits, right? Yeah, and I mean, let me take the example of actually reserving a table at a restaurant, right? I have usually a lot of personal data is is offered, right? I have to actually give my name, maybe even at some point provide my credit card details to make that reservation, and I have to also provide information like how many people are in my party, right? And what time I'm coming and so on. So a lot of this data is actually quite personal to me, right? It is revealing not just in terms of my unique identity, but also revealing about my schedule for that day. But I offer this data usually in return for actually getting a service, right? I want to dine there and so on. But there are also actually these examples in this quadrant, right? That actually falls under services like social benefits. This is particularly true for more marginalized populations that often has to provide a lot of data, right? For instance, how much does their household earn every month? Whether they have someone in the family has been to jail, right? In return to for some social benefits, right? But people who actually provide this kind of personal data to get social benefits, right, later they may move to a certain quadrant, right, which is number 2, which is surveillance, which I'll come to in a bit, right? And then you have number 2, where there's also personal data, right? Same kinds of personal data, but it's often used for surveillance purposes, right? And surveillance such as policing, keeping track of actually repeat offenders of a crime, and COVID-19, right, is a kind of surveillance, which I'll get to in a while. So earlier I said, right, sometimes you offer personal data in return in exchange for social benefits, right? And this kind of transaction, this kind of exchange, right, is can fall under quadrant 1, right, where you actually receive the benefits. But a lot of the data you receive, right, can at some point, or rather the data that you offer that's recorded, right, can at some point become used for surveillance purposes. For instance, right, more vulnerable populations coming from who may have actually records of offenses in the family, right? They a lot of their data, right, can be actually recorded, captured at multiple points in return for to qualify for certain social benefits, right? But such data can also be used for surveillance purposes, right? So this quadrant is not fixed, right? My main point is that it's not fixed, right? One type one per or rather one data transaction, right, involving certain types of data with an associated certain purpose, right, at some point it can move to a second or third quadrant, right, depending on the purposes or depending on what is done to the data, right? And then you have actually on the other bottom axis, right, bottom right, where you have actually impersonal data that's used for surveillance as well. So so here data cannot actually be linked uniquely, right? They are more used for surveillance and control, right? Yeah, I mean, I talked about actually public transport a lot, right? And controlling, identifying certain areas in the city with high risk of crime or social unrest. Right. So the data here is actually not personal, right? But what I also think is possible is that it can become personal, right? It can actually move into other quadrants, right? The upper quadrants, depending on what is done with the data, right? So for instance, if I'm just a data point, contributing to yeah, an area being identified as a high crime or high risk of crime or social unrest area, right? Someone could use the CCTV, right, or camera, and actually do another layer of processing, right, to uniquely identify myself, right? Then that's when um, I may actually be in quadrant 3, right? I can move into like quadrant 2, where the data actually being collected, analyzed becomes more personal now that it's uniquely linked to me, right? And it's also used for surveillance purposes. Okay, and then you have quadrant 4, where again you have impersonal data, but it's more used for service purposes, right? And yeah, I mean, impersonal data can be used to actually improve the, I guess, overall well-being of citizens, or just improve the environment a little bit. So I think I gave an example earlier, right, of yeah, particular towns in Singapore, where data about the human traffic and as well as the, yeah, general traffic, right, in certain towns, they are monitored, right, and based on the temperature of the day, right, based on the amount of traffic, human traffic we have in that town, right, and a lot of this data is actually impersonal because they don't identify people uniquely, right? But they are used to actually improve the temperature, overall temperature of the town, right? Or improve the traffic flow in the town. So, so yeah, that's actually quadrant 4, right? So just to illustrate, right, how the quadrants work, I would like to share 2 examples, right? So the first example is, I guess, COVID and data, right? So in a bit, I would love to hear your own experiences with COVID and contact tracing. So this is actually, I'm using the case of Singapore, where, and Singapore was one of the first countries to come up with an app to do contact tracing. And this app is known as TraceTogether, right? It is sort of, in a bit, I'll show you the video as to how the app works, right? But just to give you a sense of, which quadrant it comes under, right? It is, I think, it definitely comes under the area of surveillance, right? Because all contact tracing is about actually surveillance, is surveilling for COVID cases, right? And for the purpose of, I guess, yeah, overall well-being of everyone in the country, right? But and there is actually quite a bit of personal data, right? But it is, yeah, based on my study of contact tracing apps, right, the level of how personal the data is, right, actually depends on what data is collected, right? And now I can share with you in a while, elaborate more about what I mean. But just very quickly, in TraceTogether, for instance, it does actually record, where you have been, right? Which checkpoints you have been, right? And if you have been you're diagnosed as a confirmed case, for instance, then the data that's stored in the TraceTogether app, right? They will need to be shared with the health authority, and that's when the health authority try to identify others who may have been sort of infected because you visited all these places. But the information they have about other people, right, is actually IDs, right? It is actually not as personal as what we think, right? It's actually just exchanging handphone signals, right? That leads them to identify, all these actually other people. So I've other contact tracing apps I've seen like would really identify like the unique person, not just the ID on their actually handphone, right? So actually TraceTogether is a bit different from that sense. So I will locate it actually as two, right? Where it is actually in this quadrant where personal data is actually being used for surveillance purposes. But because of the policy TraceTogether has on personal data, right, it's actually not as high, right? Not as high, on the personal uh, data spectrum. Okay, I've actually rambled a lot about TraceTogether. It's time to show you what it is, right? Okay, let me just reshare this because I didn't think that I switch on the share computer sound option. Okay, so I think this works now. So yeah, this video is just about 3 minutes long. Right after I play this video, we can have a discussion about contact tracing and your respective experiences a little bit. Okay, I didn't check, but I hope all of you were able to hear the sound. So as you can see, right, I mean, uses Bluetooth signals, and the kinds of data that's exchanged is actually anonymized, it's encrypted as well. So yeah, actually, I won't really know, right? I won't be able to actually access what my app actually captures, right, in terms of people around me, until it's necessary, right? And even I won't be able to have, as an individual citizen, I won't be able to actually have access to such data, right? It is the health authorities and the contact tracers that actually have access. So I think this, of course, the way this app works, right, has some issues. For instance, uh, yeah, everyone needs to kind of download the app, right, in order for it to be effective. You also need to switch on your Bluetooth, right, in order for the signals to be exchanged. So I know for a fact that, yeah, I mean, in the first few months of this implementation, Singapore had a big problem, right? Because the app didn't quite work very well in the background with Apple phones. So on the Apple platform, yeah, the app couldn't just run in the background. It had to be on all the time, right, for it to be activated, right? And this also means that if I'm running TraceTogether on my iPhone, I won't be able to do anything else on my phone. Of course, that was a major point of major pain point for many people, and that's why yeah, people just didn't want to download the app, especially if they are using iPhones. So yeah, I mean, and then yeah, the other key point about this particular approach is that the data is not automatically uploaded to yeah, central server or anything, right? The data is actually stored on the phone, I think, for 25 days until, and then after 25 days, it will just like automatically purge, right? And but yeah, within the 25 days, if one is actually diagnosed as a COVID-19 case, then the data is actually, yeah, you have to authorize the data to be transferred to the health authority. So that's actually, yeah, how TraceTogether works. But yeah, I mean, there are actually many, there's been many thought pieces, many articles also about how COVID-19 actually has contributed to the rise of surveillance purposes, right? Using technologies, yeah, all over the world, right? Now that is a pandemic. So yeah, at this point, I would like to, I guess, hear from all of you, right, in terms of your experiences with contact tracing, right? Maybe if it helps, right, you can make use of this particular spectrum, right, to talk about, the level of surveillance as well as the level of personal data that's actually collected, right? That's actually involved in contact tracing. Yeah. And yeah, I just see that Sophia, you have a question.
Oh, not really a question because just now I was just wondering how other countries actually cope with the pandemic, and I just went to Google about Taiwan. So the link that I posted is just something small that I found. It's just how civic technology can help stop a pandemic, and yeah, there was this, so they were talking about how uh how tech actually facilitates like collective action. So I thought that was interesting.
Mm, mm.
Yeah, but I didn't want to go off track too much, so I just posted it in the link lah.
Okay, yeah, thanks. Yeah, so yeah, maybe anyone would like to share, their own experience, right, with COVID-19 and contact tracing in your own country, right? And yeah, try applying this framework, right, in terms of where on the spectrum it lies. Not Sophia, because I just talked about Singapore, right? And Sophia's from Singapore.
Okay.
Maybe
Hi.
someone in the room.
Hi, Nat. I just quickly respond to Sophia's question. Yeah, because Sophia is interested in how we use the so-called technology pandemic prevention measures in Taiwan. So, for instance, the real name mask distribution system in the very beginning, like last February, was actually done by a civil engineering IT people in Thailand because he notified lots of people feel a little bit panicking about not able to get in the mask in the drugstores. So he just used a Google map and then just mapping and helping people to locate the exact place and then to avoid a long queue. However, the traffic is huge and then he couldn't afford the bills. And within just several hours and our digital minister Andrew Tan stepped in because he used to be the IT person or more like a civil engineering himself. And then so he just helped this person and the group, civic groups, and then being the bridge with the government and provided the funding and then also sort of revamp and then redevelop the whole platforms. So right now, if we check online, we have dozens of different kind of mass distribution app or website or anything that people can very conveniently to look for the mask they really want to wear. And then also, Nat just mentioned about the social you have the app, right? So tracing together. Yeah, in Taiwan, yesterday, honestly, I just downloaded the social distance app myself because we suddenly have several people near Taipei area and took the bus and the MRT. And recently, we feel a little bit panicking. In the past, everything seems fine, but right now, the social distancing app was developed, I think, in last April, but we did not really use it until now because we do see the danger seems quite close to I think me because in Taipei. So they were like within like 2 meters, and then they will notify you whether people have the quarantine history or any records, and then you can pay. You can raise your alarm and then keep the distance. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. Thanks, Trisha, for sharing. And I think, I mean, just in the interest of time, right? This rise of, I mean, COVID-19 is absolutely actually, I guess, crucial, for governments, right? I mean, to respond in a way that can help, yeah, their people actually overcome and deal with the COVID-19 crisis. But I guess one concern that people have is just how it paves the way for surveillance. Yeah, post COVID-19 era, many societies that, I mean, the predictions which I agree with, right, is that many societies would already be structured in a way for over surveillance. And yeah, the question is also what people can do about that, right? So I guess this goes back to, one of the key principles of GDPR, which is purpose of use, right? And data minimization will become also quite crucial, right, in terms of I guess limiting the issue of over surveillance as well. And I mean, I think it's also quite important to make sure that, yeah, people actually trust the whole process as well, right? And the transparency that's involved in terms of what data is collected, what is used for, yeah, and when, yeah, just this general accountability, right, is quite important for citizens. Yeah, okay. So maybe just in the interest of time, let me move on, right? I talked about, I guess, uh, quadrant two, right? Which is personal data used for surveillance purposes, right? I want to also talk about actually quadrants, yeah, 1 and 4, right? In the next example. So this next example actually gives you a glimpse of what Singapore is doing, right, in terms of actually using smart technologies, smart applications to redesign public housing in Singapore. I think it's actually quite exciting. You will see that a lot of the purposes, right, here is for is on the spectrum of the services, right? But in terms of personal, whether or not the data is personal or impersonal, actually there's a range. So without further ado, let me play this video. Yeah, HDB, by the way, I should clarify, stands for the Housing Development Board of Singapore. In Singapore, this is actually an agency that looks after the development of public housing in Singapore. So, okay, sorry, I know you're all overdue for a break, and I'm sorry for running over time, right? Now that you've actually seen the two cases, right? Uh, I love to hear your views about what you thought of, yeah, the two cases that I've shown, right? One of public housing in Singapore and one of COVID-19. But yeah, I'd like to give you your 10-minute break now. But so during the break, right, when we come back, we can either, yeah, discuss your responses to, yeah, the two cases I've seen, right? Or maybe if you can think about this during your break as well, right? Think about an example of a concern you have about data in the context of your own city, right? For those in the room, it'll be Taiwan, right? For Lucas in Germany, right? And Singapore. Sophia in Singapore as well, you may have other concerns that I've not addressed, right? So where do you think this concern, right, is located in terms of the quadrant, right? So the quadrant I'm talking about, right, is this quadrant, right? Where do you think your concern lies in, right? Which quadrant is it, right? In what ways do you think it can shift as well? Let me see what's the time. Okay, so that brings me to the break. I'll see you in 10 minutes. Okay, I hope people are back.
Welcome back.
Okay, great.
Okay.
Thanks, Lucas. Okay. Yeah, before the break, I asked everyone to think about the data concerns and that you might have, or maybe if you have thoughts about, the cases I've shared, right? For instance, about public housing in Singapore, right? And how it's gonna, I mean, our public housing agency is actually incorporating lots of smart city applications, right, in its redesign. So I'm looking for, I guess, either responses to the videos, or if you'd like to share about data concerns, right? Uh, I would like to hear what they are, and what are your thoughts, in terms of which quadrant it's located in, and um, what do you think can be done, right, about those concerns? Okay, so anyone? So I know Sophia has something to share. Maybe if Lucas or anyone in the room, right, if you have things to share, right, feel free to come up to the laptop as well.
Okay, while the rest are preparing, I can share first. So I posted the link in the chat, and basically it's also in line with what was mentioned earlier regarding who can we trust to access the data. So as you might know, COVID, this TraceTogether is really about how it's really an initiative by the government to fight the pandemic, and it's a way to collect data regarding who we come into contact with. So initially, the consensus was that the data will only be used to track the virus, and this was what the public was informed lah. But during but in the parliament meeting, there was this minister who actually said that actually the police might use the data for in criminal investigation, but otherwise, TraceTogether data is only to be used for contact tracing and to fight COVID. So when this news actually was reviewed, then there was quite a bit of a response. People were concerned that the government might use the data for other purposes, and in a sense, it was a bit like a breach of trust, as a breach of trust. And I think that this case also is a good reflection of how, as technology is becoming increasingly important to fight against the pandemic, it's not just a data privacy issue, but it's also like a public health and governance issue.
Mm.
To answer the question, I think it's in quadrant two. Yeah.
Quadrant 2, yeah, thanks, Sophia. I mean, I think the issue is that there is like a prevailing law to say in Singapore, right? To say that all kinds of data can be used for criminal investigation. And I mean, when they realized that, actually in the beginning, there was a public declaration. I mean, quite a public announcement, right, to say that TraceTogether is only used for contact tracing. But when that came through, right, people were confused, right, and became a bit more doubtful about future uses or purposes of the data. Maybe in the interest of time, just one more, right? Maybe someone in the room, or Lucas.
If nobody wants in the room, I can go ahead.
Yep.
Okay.
I can't really see people in the room. Sorry.
All right. So we have in Germany actually one app which is, I think, kind of perfect because it's completely decentralized and anonymous. So you still get notified if somebody has contracted COVID, but still you're completely anonymous. But now we have the issue. This app we have, it doesn't have a kind of cluster detection. So if, for example, 100 people in one restaurant get still hear me?
Yep. No. Yes.
My headset battery just died, but now my laptop speaker works. Okay, so it doesn't have any cluster recognition. So now actually a private company started with the support of some prominent musicians to build a second app. And now some state regulators actually buy the license of this app, which is completely centralized and has actually some security flaws. So now we have this clash of kind of two apps in Germany, one which is perfect regarding data, and one which is more efficient regarding the recognition of corona cases. But yeah, I don't like it. I don't have the second app because in Germany you still have this World War II era in mind. What could a malicious party do with this kind of data?
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, that's very interesting. So, just so to clarify, this second app, right? Is it compliant? Does it follow the principles of GDPR?
Technically, yes. I mean, it's allowed to store data centrally. The issue they have currently is with some security flaws, but they haven't been hacked, so there is no penalty or something. But they just released the source code publicly online, so now they face a lot of scrutiny. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. Thanks, Lucas, for sharing. Yeah, I always enjoy your stories from Germany because it's really a different context. And yeah, I mean, I think in Germany, yeah, it's quite true. Actually, there is a long history of actually concerns that people have with data, right? Especially like you said, actually, the way data was used in the World War, right? Yeah. So yeah, and which is something actually different for many of us because I mean in Singapore we don't really have that kind of history. So we have actually, I think, just looking at the discourse coming from citizens, right, is quite different as well. The concerns are quite different as well. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Thanks, Sophia and Lucas, for sharing. Okay. Let me actually come to the final part, right? Which is what can we do, right? And after actually looking at all this, actually the understanding of the data landscape and all the issues associated with different types of data collection, yeah, we also recognize, I think, that I mean, there is this concept of active citizenship in the context of politics, for instance, right? Active citizenship is about going to vote. It's about being informed about policies and casting your vote for the right people. But there's this question of in a data-driven city, right? What does active citizenship looks like? And I agree with, I mean, the authors of the readings this week, who both argue that data active citizenship in a data-driven city is about data participation. And what does that mean? It means that when there are applications, when there are actually these smart city applications, that emerge, right? The citizen is willing to participate, right? Participate both in terms of um, I think being willing to have data that's collected, right? But also potentially participate in decision making about how such collection should be done, and how such data should be analyzed and used. So that's actually data participation, in terms of its gist and central idea. But of course, there are some challenges, right? And one of the challenges is that citizens increasingly experience what Van Zunen describes as invisible visibility. Now, what does this mean? This means that actually more and more citizens are actually becoming more visible, right? We have all kinds of data that's being collected about us, but yet uh, this is invisible to the citizen, right? So even though we are becoming more visible to institutions, to the state, to companies, right? We this kind of visibility, increased visibility, is actually invisible to many of us as citizens. So that's what invisible visibility means, right? And there are all kinds of vulnerabilities that's associated with this invisible visibility, right? And one of it is just, um, uh, the loss of privacy, for instance, right? And when there's not much of a decision making, right? Not much participation in terms of how data is gathered and analyzed. There could be potential discrimination as well. So we don't have to look very far for examples, right? Just look around us for cases that's where this is being talked about. For instance, there is a very famous uh, lady, right, who just got sort of fired. I think she was either asked to leave or she got fired. I can't remember, but she deals with the issue of discrimination in the algorithms in AI, right, at Google. And what she found was that there's a lot of biases that's actually coded in the algorithms, right? There is this, I think, documentary called, I think, Coded Bias, right? That talks about her work, right? If you are all free this weekend, you can check it out. Coded Bias, I think it's released online. Coded Bias actually uh, delves deeper into this issue of discrimination and biases, right? That comes through, for instance, facial recognition technology that recognize, people who are white much better than they recognize people of color. They also so you may wonder what this means, right? The implications are always in the usage, right? So when facial recognition technologies, for instance, are being used to identify criminals, right? This means that the likelihood of misrecognition, it can be quite high as well, right? Especially when it comes to people of color. So yeah, and when citizens are not actually aware of these kinds of vulnerabilities, right, they are not able to participate, right? I mean, it's almost like a circular loop, right? If they're not aware, they're not able to participate, where yet such participation is incredibly important to generating greater awareness as well. And when they are not aware that their data, how their data is actually collected, what data is collected, how they are used, right? They are also unaware about the potential ways, right, that their opinions or their behaviors can be manipulated. So so we see that a lot with in the case of Cambridge Analytica, where I mean, just millions of accounts of data were released, right? And people were not aware that how their data was used, how they were collected. And I mean, they were seeing actually ads and content that were manipulative without actually even knowing about it, right? So this is actually another example of vulnerabilities that is actually incredibly challenging, right? To even think about how we develop data-driven participation. I think the other challenge, right, has to do with accountability. Even if we are aware of what data is being collected, how they are used and analyzed, right? The lines of accountability are often not so clear, right? And this is because lots of smart city kinds of applications and technologies, they are developed together with private entities. And this has, again, different implications, right? If we are developing, like, if we are collecting data, right, in collaboration with a private entity, because of the tech they offer, or because of the tech that's developed, right? Who owns this data, right? How can such data be governed? Many tech companies that I speak to believe that they own the data. They own everything, all the data that's collected, because they develop technologies to collect such data in the first place, right? I do question that assumption. But yeah, this is actually a conversation and a dialogue that we need to have with more and more people, right? Not just with tech companies. Um, yeah, and there's also like a potential domination of economic or rather neoliberal values, right, and issues. Uh, Private entities, they want to they work on things that's configurable, that's scalable, right? Mainly because of the economic benefit that they perceive at the end of it, right? So when but there may be certain issues, certain problems that are actually important to citizens but not doesn't have economic benefits, right? So the bigger question is when we are completely if we are completely reliant on private entities, right? What happens to these concerns? What happens to these problems? Um, so yeah, I mean, which is also why I think in Singapore, there is a recognition that there's a lot of social issues and topics of that are important to the common good in Singapore that is far too, and it is far too risky to just leave it to private entities to deal with. So in Singapore, right, there is a general approach to deal with that from the government itself, which is why in Singapore there's this agency called GovTech, right, government technology, that's dedicated to look after these interests. And Yeah, and the third implication that I like to, I guess, present, right, that has to do with this blurred lines of accountability, has to do with trust, right? In the past, before all these smart city applications came about, right, when the Department of Health, for instance, comes knocking at our door or collects data about us, we know that they are the ones accountable, right? There is certain trust or distrust we have with that entity, right? But when with the prevalence of such technologies, right, there is a certain shift of trust, right? Or rather, the trust becomes much more multifaceted, where we have to trust or distrust, right? Not just the state, but also some kind of trust needs to be transferred to the technologies itself as well, right? Like for instance, whether or not the server or the cloud is configured to be secure and safe. We have to also kind of understand, right? Especially when something is actually developed together with a private entity, we have to understand who that private entity is, right? In order to trust the overall transaction. So yeah, that's why this is a question mark, right? Because this trust, right, is no longer just uh, residing in one particular entity, but it's actually multiple entities now, including uh, yeah, systems and technologies. In the past, living in a city would be like living together with your family as well as strangers, right? Where the state becomes, right, yeah, someone or something you have a vertical relationship with. But now more and more we are living with not just strangers, but also living with systems. So we have to be able to understand the whole entire ecosystem, right? Again, that is a challenge because how much we can participate, right? In terms of active citizenry depends very much on how well we understand all of this, the entire ecosystem. Um, but there are some solutions, right? So I do want to end on a positive and not dismal notes. So just very quickly, some solutions are frame things like frameworks to look at data governance, right? We have talked about the GDPR in the EU quite a bit, right? And it's actually high level framework that's used to address a number of problems such as over collection of data, right? And we have also, I think, in the literature, this is still quite scarce, right? But I think increasingly, cities are also exploring opportunities for, yeah, participation from citizens, right? yeah, creating living lab, or working with citizens to co-create or co-decide, right, what data to collect and how data should be used to address problems in their community is an example of citizen-driven solution. You also see the example of actually having apps to crowdsource problems and solutions, right? Many cities actually have these apps, and you have actually technological or design solutions, right? For instance, like coming up with technologies to enhance privacy, or technologies to enhance transparency about data governance and data policies, right? Or you have actually, technological solutions like having a cloud, right? That's highly secure, and having using that to address some of the privacy concerns. Last but not least, yeah, another potential solution is to try to, I guess, explore impact assessment, right, as a tool. So when there is a new application that comes up, right, there's some kind of assessment about the privacy risks, and then the mitigations are more targeted in that sense. So just a final comment, right? In the interest of time, right? Had wanted us to discuss this, but let me just also say that a lot of actually these solutions, like the technological solutions, or even the impact assessment and governance frameworks, right? They are actually quite effective in terms of actually scaling up the solution to address the problem, right? But one issue about these solutions is that they don't always, yeah, they still don't actually help the citizen to understand, right, how their data is used, right? They don't address concerns about privacy as well, because yeah, for the citizen, right, they may still be completely unaware about how to actually how their data is actually protected, right, with privacy enhancing technologies. So increasingly, I see the importance of actually data citizenship, right? Citizen-driven solutions as crucial to actually enhance the level of trust, as well as, yeah, I guess understanding about how their data is used, what data is collected, and how they are analyzed, right? So yeah, I have, I think, just 2 minutes, right? So let me spend the 2 minutes talking about the after class activity. I would like you to, I'll post this in Moodle, right? And I'd like you to take a look at the last slide, right? We talked about actually quite a lot of problems associated with data collection, analysis, and use today, right? But take a look at these 4 types of solutions I've mentioned, right? And just give your opinion, right? No more than 200 to 300 words. Give your opinion about which solution to addressing data privacy concerns, in your opinion, is most ideal, right? You may think, for instance, yeah, data citizenship most crucial, right? That's your opinion, and explain why, right? Um, and or you may think that it is a combination of things, right? You need the high level governance framework, but at the same time you need the citizen driven kind of solutions as well, right? No right or wrong answer, as I mentioned, right? This is actually an ongoing uh, challenge, ongoing problem that we cities, countries, or and collectives, right? Civil society, we are still trying to come up with an answer, right? So don't worry, there's no right or wrong answer to this, right? Just your opinions about which one you think is most ideal and why. Okay, any questions?
Oh,
Yeah, Sophia, you have a question?
does someone else have a question? Okay. then I'll go first. Yeah, I wanted to just ask, cause the previous slide you show us a very varied way of of addressing the issue, and I thought that while these solutions are good, but it's also very idealistic to think that they I think I find it very idealistic at the same time, and even though they're all important. But I wanted to ask if there are any instances where um some solutions that have been executed well that you can think of.
Actually, all of them are not ideals. All of them are solutions that's already been explored in different cities, right? I mean, I've talked about GDPR, right? That's a governance framework that's in the EU, but in fact, yeah, different countries they have their own kind of framework as well, right? In Singapore, there is the PDPA, right, which is the Personal Data Protection Act, right, looked after by the Personal Data Commission, right? I think actually in Taiwan has a lot of actually citizen-driven solution, right? But I also know that in Rotterdam, for instance, they have actually they use crowdsourcing, right? To actually get citizens to share their yeah, actually give their inputs about data use in the city. Yeah, and it's not just Rotterdam. I mean, in Asia as well, India, for instance, they have a lot of civil society actually that's actually participating in discussing the yeah, data protection bill. So yeah, I would say they are not ideal. They are actually already solutions that's used by various cities. Yeah.
Mm, okay, okay. I think after you explain, then it gives a bit more context as to like which framework is best suited for that social political climate also.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. Any other? Yes, Trisha.
Because today is the last lesson, and I think we all learned a lot about Singapore and then specific issues in data governance and also I think previously mobilization, disinformation. And thank you so much, bring Singapore and also the very, I would say, your expertise in these important issues related to digital and the new media. And thank you so much. Let's give Dr. Pen a big hand.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Thank
Yeah,
you.
and I really enjoy all the discussions and sharing as well. So thanks everyone in the room, and thank you, Lucas and Sophia,
Yeah.
for your participation.
Thank
Yeah.
you, thank you.